Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sally Guy, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Canadian Association of Social Workers, and I have the honor of moderating today's presentation, which is titled An Introduction to Anti-Black Racism, and it's the first in a three-part Lunch and Learn series presented by Senator Wanda Thomas-Bernard. So before introducing our distinguished speaker, I will just quickly go over some housekeeping for everyone. Today's presentation is going to be approximately 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. I do encourage you to type at any time, and I will begin asking them at the end of the presentation. The recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow on CSW's website under the Continuing Education tab, and the slides are available for download right now under the resource widget at the left hand of your screen. And finally, a certificate of attendance will be available at the end of the presentation. Just click that yellow rightmost icon at the bottom of the window when the presentation is wrapping up. So with that said, it's my honor to introduce Senator Wanda Thomas-Bernard. Senator Bernard is a passionate advocate, educator, and social worker from East Preston, Nova Scotia, and the list of her achievements is astounding. Senator Bernard practiced frontline social work in Nova Scotia with African Nova Scotian communities province-wide. She is the first African Canadian to become a tenured professor at Dalhousie University and was also the director of Dalhousie School of Social Work for 10 years. She's also one of the founding members of the Association of Black Social Workers. In 2004, she was awarded the great honor of the Order of Canada for her work addressing racism and diversity. And in 2014, she was awarded the Order of Nova Scotia as well. In 2016, Bernard was appointed to the Senate, and she is the first African Nova Scotian woman to serve in the Senate chamber. As you can probably already tell, providing a list of all of her contributions and achievements would probably be a webinar in itself, so I do encourage you to get to know more about her in the bio on the right hand of your screen. We are so thankful that Senator Bernard's wisdom and expertise are helping to guide the future of our country, and her presence in the Senate inspires so much pride in our profession. We're very grateful to have her presenting this important series. So with that said, I will turn the microphone over to our speaker and welcome Senator Bernard.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you for your introduction. Let me say thank you to everyone who's here. I appreciate your interest in the topic. So as noted, this topic is an introduction to anti-Black racism. So let me give you a bit of a roadmap in terms of what we're going to do in this time. We'll talk a bit about what anti-Black racism is. We'll review some of those layers of racism, and then highlight manifestations of anti-Black racism. I'll use a case study, and then we'll talk about how you can use this knowledge in practice, in different practice contexts. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk a bit about the plan for Part 2 and Part 3, and then there'll be opportunity for your questions and any comments. So I want to talk a bit about the interconnectedness of the historical context and the current situation, which gives us this issue of anti-Black racism that we want to talk about. So one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that the past does inform and influence the present. Slavery was real in Nova Scotia, although many Canadians like to believe that it wasn't. It was real in Nova Scotia and in other parts of Canada as well. And this set the stage for marginalization of citizens of African descent. For example, in the Nova Scotian context, the broken promises, for example, land grants that were promised to the Black Loyalists when they arrived, or being given land that was very rocky, very infertile, and expected to live off the land. We also saw that whole experience of slavery and early presence of African people in the country dating back to the 1600s, followed by segregation. Now, we didn't have legal segregation such as the Jim Crow laws here like they had in the U.S., but we had segregation. So again, in Nova Scotia, communities very segregated, isolated, off from the mainstream. 54 Black communities were established at that time in those early years. And in those segregated communities, there were also legally segregated schools. Schools were legally segregated in Nova Scotia until 1954. I don't often say this, but I actually am old enough to have gone to a segregated school. I would say it was probably the best foundation I could have received, but there were also systemic disadvantages because of that segregation. Lack of access to opportunities would be, another of the history, but also part of the present. Lack of access to things that people take for granted. For example, access to shops and businesses. I'm sure most of you on the line are familiar with the story of Viola Desmond and her not being allowed to sit in the main theater and being charged, and we know that history. But even several years before that, the late Carrie Best had the same experience, but it didn't hit the national media. And so we saw this, banks and stores had no people of African descent working in them, nor were they allowed in them. The late Senator Calvin Ruck often tells the story of when he moved to Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, from Halifax. He tried to take his son to a barber shop, and he was refused service. And that experience led him to become a social activist. And so we have this history. We have this history of marginalization, this history of segregation, that history of slavery, and that really set the context for white supremacy and white privilege. And so what we see today is the cycle of marginalization has continued. We see this cycle of unequal access. We see this history of unnamed and therefore unresolved trauma that comes from those experiences. And then what you end up with is anti-Black racism. So just to talk a bit more about anti-Black racism, we're really looking at an interconnected web of racism that, as I said, is rooted in white supremacy. So if you think about intersectionality, the overlapping oppressions, which really magnifies the barriers that people are experiencing. For example, a Black queer woman living with a disability, she's dealing with anti-Black racism, but she's also dealing with homophobia, and she's also dealing with ableism, all of these in the context of her everyday life. Her oppressions are clearly interconnected. When with anti-Black racism, it's also important to think about the cumulative effect of these multiple layers of racism. One thing that's really clear is that the everydayness of anti-Black racism teaches young people especially to not have dreams, to not have hopes, to not have expectations. It's important to consider the cumulative effect because one incident of racism may not seem like a big deal, but over time, the multiple layers of anti-Black racism and continuous incidents will create greater issues like health, impact on health. In the Racism, Violence, and Health Project on racism-related stress score, for example, younger people were more bothered by racism, and it had a greater impact on them. And so that impact of the cumulative effect of racism is more severe. It's not visible, but at times it may also be that accumulation of anger that can easily become rage. Anti-Black racism is also so deeply ingrained that it has almost become normalized. You hear a lot of people say that's just the way things work around here, and I often hear that in Nova Scotia. That's just the way things are here. So people learn not to expect things to be any different. And so those notions of inferiority become internalized as well. And it impacts one's health and one's well-being overall. I was absolutely thrilled when the UN report on anti-Black racism was released in September. I found it professionally and personally so validating because it spoke to all of the things that I've been dealing with as an advocate, for well over 40 years. That report speaks clearly to the fact that Canada has not addressed racial injustices in our country. It gives examples of hate crimes. It gives wonderful examples of systemic anti-Black racism in the criminal justice system. It speaks to the issues around access to education and access to health care, access to housing, adequate housing, access to employment. And those are all things that clearly any of us who've been working on anti-Black racism have been dealing with for many, many years. And beyond that, they make some really good recommendations for systemic changes, which is great. The report, if you haven't read the report, please do so. I think you can find a link to it on our website. But it discusses the historical injustices as examples, like the forced relocation of Africville. It also talks about the importance of restorative justice and apologies, the need for apologies for communities. But that report, beyond highlighting the issues and the problems, it also emphasizes the importance of celebrating the many contributions that African Canadians have made to this country. And, given our presence here since the early 1600s, there have been many, but they've been invisible and unacknowledged for the most part. And so lots of recommendations there to the Government of Canada, to Nova Scotia, the province, recommendations for policy changes around Afrocentric educational opportunities, a justice strategy for African Canadians, and also a recommendation to implement diversity training for the federal government. So these are all things that I would hope in the coming months that various levels of government, but also organizations will really look at. And having all of you participating in this seminar today, I think, gives me a lot of hope. So if we look at those layers of racism, it's important for us to understand and unpack these multiple layers of racism and the complexity of these. So the individual, institutional, cultural, and systemic. So if we look at each of these in a bit more detail, we'll start with cultural racism. So in a nutshell, we can think about cultural racism as a form of racism that permeates all aspects of our society. So we have assumptions and stereotypes. People get an idea of what a person of African descent is, or should be, or what kind of cultural nuances that they have. Once those assumptions are made, then that remains. So we have this unconscious bias. And one of the things that's particularly frustrating, I think, is that whole idea that mainstream cultural expressions are seen as the norm. And so anything outside of that is viewed very differently and through that lens. And I'm looking at the lens of anti-Black racism. I'll just give you one example. When people of African descent decide to dress in their native dress, they're often referred to as dressing in native costumes. Not a costume, it's native dress. But because it's outside of the mainstream, it's viewed very differently. Unconscious biases become a part of in the way that cultural racism is presented in the everyday. And unconscious biases are present in every other aspect of anti-Black racism. So, for example, if we move then to sort of look at institutional racism, and we look at different institutions, we'll start with education. Think about the things that happen in elementary, secondary, and post-secondary in school, just as an example. So we're thinking about what's being taught, what's the curricula, who's doing the teaching, and how is this being taught. And repeatedly, we've heard over the years, and even today, we hear from students of African descent that it's really hard for them to find themselves in the curricula. And so even when there are courses being taught, in Nova Scotia, for example, we have, in the high school, we have African Canadian Studies. And I've had students say to me, the content of the course was really, really important to me and very interesting to me, but the way it was taught. And these are examples of people, of Black students having Caucasian teachers teaching that content and teaching it without a context, teaching it without a full understanding of what it means to be Black in Canadian society. And so the what is being taught, the who is doing the teaching, and then how it's being taught are all aspects of institutional racism in the educational institutions. Then if we look at the criminal justice system, we see the whole challenges around policing. There was, I think, there's been a lot in the media in Toronto and in Halifax recently about carding or stops and searches, the overrepresentation of people of African descent who are being stopped and searched, and the kind of rationalization that comes through the system because of that. But it goes back to unconscious biases. The healthcare system. In each of these institutions, we will typically have an underrepresentation of people of African descent as staff, as managers in those institutions, and then an overrepresentation typically of people of African descent on the negative aspects of those services. So if we take child welfare as an example, although in this country we don't collect data by race, we do know that there's an overrepresentation of Black youth in care. In fact, the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia was formed back in 1979 because of that very issue. And we continue to work on that as an issue. I realize in terms of time, I better move along a bit more quickly. So individual racism. Individual racism is really those one-on-one interactions. Individual racism is use of racist language in a context when people think it's just okay without questioning. It's those individual beliefs and attitudes and behaviors, and again, that unconscious bias could be here as well. It's jokes or comments about stereotypes. If you have a tall Black male in your midst, you assume he's a basketball player. And I've heard so many young Black men talk about this over the years. Or it's those microaggressions, those subtle verbal and nonverbal interactions that happen on an everyday basis. Being asked the question, where are you really from? Or mistaking one Black person for another. So I have to stop and give you a little story here. When I was appointed to the Senate, I was still working at Dalhousie University. And I like to use this story, that my title of this story is, Will the Real Senator Bernard Please Stand Up? Because shortly after my appointment, there were two staff at Dalhousie who were consistently being congratulated for their appointment to the Senate. I looked nothing like those women. They looked nothing like me. They were as mortified as I was. But as they walked across campus, people were stopping and congratulating them. And so I just say, okay, will the real Senator Bernard please stand up? That's such a common experience for people to be mistaken. Because part of it is there's not that lack of eye contact, that lack of acknowledging your very presence, and it really sends a message. And all of these realities, individual racism, institutional racism, cultural racism, they all come together to create what we call systemic racism, that cumulative impact of these multiple layers, the interconnections of those multiple layers of racism, and how they all contribute to and reinforce each other. Systemic racism is very hard to pinpoint, making it very difficult to challenge then. And I came to a realization a few months back that one of the problems that we had was that we were trying to deal with systemic racism issues with individual responses. And clearly we need more systemic responses to address systemic racism. And I believe that the UN report offers us a nice framework for doing that. So some of the manifestations of anti-Black racism, where do we see it? Where do we see anti-Black racism? So I've said already it's everywhere, every day, but we see it in the media. What gets reported in the media, how much harder you have to work to get positive stories told. We see it in poverty, the overrepresentation of Black people in poverty. We see it in housing, the number of people, overrepresentation in living in public housing. We see it in healthcare, lack of access to culturally appropriate healthcare services. We see it in employment. We see many people struggling with unemployment or underemployment. Education, I've already talked about the child welfare system and the criminal justice system. Let's look a bit more closely at underemployment. Now, I'm going to share a story, a case study of someone addressing issue of underemployment. At the cultural level, we can see conscious and unconscious biases that influence the hiring processes, that influence decisions. We have people who are screened out of employment opportunities based on their names and maybe based on their addresses. When I moved back to East Preston after having been out for a number of years, several people commented and asked, why would I do that? Because of the negative stereotyping about that community. Why would you choose to live there? Then we have the institutional barriers to obtaining higher positions. There's often this prevention from obtaining post-secondary education to be more competitive in the labor market. The lack of representation of Black professionals in higher education, the lack of access to those opportunities, the lack of access to the social capital that can actually leverage you into some of those opportunities. And then at the individual level, we see these microaggressions. Oftentimes it happens during the interview. Sometimes it may be just a surprise tone of voice or comments about who the person is. One story I've heard from a person, a Black social worker, let's bring it home to social work, a Black social worker who had a social work degree but couldn't seem to get a job outside of the group home positions, and she was overqualified for those positions. She wanted to get into other types of employment, and so she decided to go back and do her master's degree. Now, she couldn't afford to because she was really marginally employed. but she took on huge debt to go back to get her master's degree. And once she did, she was the only person in her class who was doing the master's that did not immediately get a full-time job. She tried to get a supervisor's position. She was told she didn't have enough experience. Then she decided, okay, I need another level of education. She returned and did a second master's degree. And then she was screened out of competitions because she was told she was overqualified. All of these examples have an impact. They impact a person's self-esteem. They impact a person's reality, their income, their health, and their well-being, their opportunities for housing, opportunities for growth, and personal and professional development. And that's just one story. There are many, many, many similar stories not only in social work, but many other professions as well. And so when we think about that systemic racism, that web of those interconnecting factors, we see how the challenges then seep into every other aspect of a person's life. And the reality is systemic racism can often lead then to internalized racism. And then that has an impact on a person's ability it becomes a vicious cycle then. And we talk about this cycle of unequal access. But imagine, if you would, that example I just gave you of the social worker who kept going into debt to do further post-secondary education, to create opportunities that just never materialized. The impact of that, not just on that woman, that person, but also on her children and other people in her community who may be witnessing this. It sends a really clear message, a really clear message. So then you can see how this becomes a cycle then. This is heavy, but it's also real. This is the reality of anti-Black racism, and it's just a brief introduction into some of those realities. And so how do we bring it into your practice then? How do we bring it into social work practice? How do we disrupt the oppressive, institutionalized patterns of anti-Black racism that have become so ingrained in our society? So if you are working on the front line, oftentimes people who are working on the front line sort of say, I don't have any power, what can I do? But part of it, I think, is just being aware of who you are and being aware of your values, your beliefs and attitudes, your own unconscious biases, being willing to continually unpack those. I cannot tell you the number of times I've had issues over the years when a graduate will say, well, I did your course, so I understand this stuff. But if you haven't done anything with it, and if you haven't worked on these issues, and if you haven't continued your own unlearning journey, then there's a lot more learning and unlearning that needs to happen. So what are you like with your Black coworkers or with your Black clients? I've worked with social workers who were afraid to go into Black communities. I remember a Black social work student who was doing a placement in child welfare. I remember her telling me how traumatized she was. Now, she's a social work student, and she was absolutely traumatized when she was invited to go on a call to do an apprehension. And she'd been in that office for 6 months on her placement. She'd never seen the police called to accompany a social worker, and all of a sudden she's invited into this process, and the police are called to participate in it as well. And she experienced vicarious trauma because of what she witnessed. And so if you were her colleague, how would you react in that situation? We also, I think, need to be always mindful as frontline workers. It's important to be always mindful of how anti-Black racism either creates or contributes to the circumstances that your clients are dealing with. No matter what the issue is that they're bringing forward, how is racism impacting that person? One of the things I think that happens in everyday offices every day, is racist language being used, discussions about issues or communities in a way that's demeaning, derogatory, or just racist. And when we remain silent, when we witness such conversations, then we are contributing. We're colluding. We're contributing to the oppression, to the racism. So calling in colleagues, naming it, and challenging colleagues, I think it's really important. So those are some examples of things frontline workers can do. In management, I think it's important to engage in equitable hiring processes and to set really clear goals and targets for diversity hiring. We still need to have employment equity and affirmative action in our employment settings, and being willing to just take that on and being willing to lead change. So calling it racism when it is racism, creating an anti-racist workplace, taking reports of racism seriously and dealing with them and not ignoring them. And then under the policy or the research arm, bringing that race equity lens to all of your work, looking at whose voice is present and whose voice is absent, engaging in research that really explores these issues, ensuring that presence of the African presence is included. And also just being willing to consider intersecting oppressions in any policy development. There's been a lot of work done recently on gender and gender plus. I think gender-based analysis, but really we need to look beyond gender, so looking at the intersectionality. The term that's often used is gender plus. And so if we could use that kind of analysis in all of our work, I think that would be really helpful and will help us address anti-Black racism. So I want to leave time now for some discussion. But before we do that, just want to remind you that next week we'll be talking about inclusive social work. So we'll go a bit more deeper into these topics. Part 3 we've left open for now because we want to stay on the same theme, but to drill down into one of these topics in more detail. So there are 5 options, and Sally has created a survey within the presentation. So as you log out, I would ask you to indicate which topic is more relevant to your interest, and we'll work with that. Thank you.
Well, Senator Bernard, I mean, first of all, just thank you so much for sharing that with us today, and I know that the audience is keen to get to questions. Before I even do that, though, I just want to comment on the fact that I am moderating the Q&A right now, and there are already so many thoughts of hope and of identification that are coming in. They're just saying thank you already. I just wanted to read one from Finland. It just says, just a quick note to say thank you to Senator Bernard and the CSW for bringing the issue of race and culture from a Black perspective. As an Indigenous social worker working in an Indigenous community, I see the outcomes and barriers you speak of daily, but I am hopeful. especially from a trauma-informed perspective. And already I'm looking forward to the next session. So I can't read all the comments like that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that we're reading them and that we'll get them to the Senator, and to thank you for those. And I also have to say we will do our best to group the questions together to make sure that most of them get answered, but thank you in advance for understanding if, due to time, we can't get to them all. So I'm going to jump right in and get into the questions. The first one here I have is, how can we as social workers raise awareness about anti-Black racism in our communities, and should I be doing education about anti-Black racism with my clients?
I would say yes, absolutely. And I would say look for any and all teachable moments to educate clients in sessions. And so when language is used that is questionable, calling it in the session, finding ways to do that. And those teachable moments are really great ways to open doors to have people explore more. But what's really important, I think all social workers need to be clear themselves, because if they're not, then they'll miss those teachable moments. So developing a comfort level with the discomfort, as one of my colleagues would say, developing a comfort with the discomfort. Oftentimes I'll have Caucasian social workers say, I don't feel I'm able to do this. I don't feel qualified to do this. I say, listen, none of us are really qualified. However, if we ignore it, then we become part of the problem. So it's so important just to be prepared to name these issues.
Right. I think the second question I have here is really linked to that one, and it's how do I prevent perpetuating institutional racism when policies are negatively impacting my clients and I have no control over policies or over government programs?
Well, I think we have more control than we like to admit. We don't use our voices and nearly enough. So one of the things that I've noticed since I've been here in the Senate is that very few, there's not enough lobbying that happens from social work and social workers. So I think it's really important for social workers we give up our power. So it's important for us not to give up our power. We have power. We can ask questions of people that are running for office. We can ask questions. And if we can't do it individually, well, guess what? We have organizations like the Canadian Association of Social Workers. As an organization, as workers, we need to be feeding questions around policy and so on into the organization so that they take on those big issues as an organization. As frontline workers, we're giving them the information, helping them to see how our clients are differentially impacted by policy decisions. You need to inform us. We need you to inform us on how that's happening so that we can make sure that we bring that lens to the work. Parliamentarians need to hear more from social workers, I think.
Right. Well, you are doing a great job on that. So that's why we're so glad to have you in the Senate. I have another question here from Saskatchewan, actually, that says, so what would your recommendations be to create safety to talk about anti-Black racism within your organization in order to make progress?
So let me start by saying there's no such thing as safety when you're talking about anti-Black racism. So let's get rid of the notion of creating safety, but let's think about creating what I call brave spaces. So I think we have to have brave spaces to talk about anti-Black racism, and then we try to make them as safe as we can, recognizing that there's no real safety. But the most important step in this work, I believe, is finding allies. And so if you're in an organization, it's not wise to just go off and, try to jump into situations without knowing the facts, knowing the issues, and then also knowing where your support is. So finding those allies, that's where I would start.
Right.
And one would hope would be support and allyship.
Lots of questions about, this one kind of frames most of them, but do you have advice for identifying our own racist internal attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors?
Yes. My advice about that would be willing to do the hard work.
Right.
Being willing to look at oneself. One of the things that always sort of infuriates me when I call an issue of racism that I've experienced or witnessed, and you get a sort of a half apology that goes something like this: I'm sorry if I offended you.
Yeah.
And so if I've told you I'm offended, then yes, you've offended me. So that kind of statement sort of closes the door. What we want is to create space for doors to be opened. And so just being willing to really look at oneself. What have I done? What am I saying? I was in a workshop earlier this week, and I used an ableist word to describe a point I was trying to make. And the minute I said it, I was so embarrassed. And the minute I said it, I stopped myself. And I thought, okay, I've done this in public. I need to apologize in public, but also explain to these folks what it is. And I think we need to be brave enough to do that around issues of racism as well. For anyone to say, well, I'm not racist. If you grew up in this country and you're not a racialized person, then yes, you are racist. So what are you doing to become anti-racist? And that requires action. And part of that action is being willing to just own who you are and where it's at. And then, so what do you do about that? How do you unlearn? How do you engage? How do you push and test yourself and push your own boundaries? That's so vitally important.
This next one I think is completely related to that, and to being open to seeing how you are failing and how you could change. This comes from Ontario, and they say, thank you, Senator Bernard, for this great webinar. I appreciate your knowledge, insight, and passion. They say, in a training session recently, a participant said, I don't see color, and everyone is the same to me. And this is a sentiment that comes back often from members of the dominant group. How can we educate people that statements like this can actually perpetuate racism?
So I think first off, we start by saying, when you say you don't see color, you're basically telling me that that in itself is a form of racism, to totally deny one's reality, and it's not very helpful. So I think one of the things that's really, really important is dialogue. So trying to get people into a space where they can have a courageous conversation. So one of the things that I use is what I call the gentle art of questioning. So if someone were to say to me, so I don't really see color, so I'd say, so what does that really mean? What do you mean by that? When you say you don't see color, when I look in the mirror, I see a black woman looking back at me. And so when you look at me, who do you see? So the courageous conversations, that's what comes to mind when I hear that question.
Right. I have a question here, too, about I guess different population groups or different demographics. That says, I work in a youth organization. Do you have any tips on confronting racism among young folks, or are there differences in the approach versus that with adults?
I think in any of our organizational contexts, we need to work within the context that we have. And so, if you're working with youth, I would say one of the things that I would do with youth would be to address issues of race in a vacuum. So you're addressing it in that broader context of other forms of oppressions as well. And again, sort of get them into dialogues and that sort of thing. Popular culture is a good way, I think, to engage with youth.
Right.
I mean, I was going to say one of the challenging age groups that I have worked with over the years would be elders. You know, I have just great respect for elders, but I've also experienced a lot of racism from elders, and I know that, you know, much of it is not intentional. I remember once being invited into a nursing home to do a workshop on, it was during Black History Month, so I was invited in to talk about Black history. And when I came into the space, everyone there said, "Oh, we're so happy you're here. You know, what are you going to sing for us today?" Oh. And I was mortified, but, you know, I know that comes out of that racist stereotype about Black people being good singers. And so I know it was well-meaning, and I was there to talk about Black history. So anyway, sometimes I use humor as well as a way to get people to sort of think about what they've just said. So some of you may be wondering, so how did you deal with that? So in that instance, I just said, so I'm not here to sing or to dance, but I'm looking forward to talking to you about Black culture today. And then I went on and really spent time highlighting the positives of the Black community. And I didn't react to what was said because I recognized the space that it was coming from.
Right.
Didn't mean that it didn't have an impact on me, you know, so part of what I had to do was do a lot of debriefing of that afterwards, but not wanting to and recognizing what was really possible with that population that I was dealing with. And many of the folks in that home, in the unit that I was on, had dementia. So.
Right. This one, I think, is coming from a perspective of a manager, and they say, I'm a manager at a social services agency. Would it be beneficial for the social workers at my agency to have cultural competency training in order to gain an understanding of other cultures and to help serve clients effectively?
So that's a great question. These have all been great questions, by the way. But let me just say, with this whole thing about cultural competency, so there's a whole debate in the literature about this notion of competency. And I think the strongest recommendations that I appreciate are saying that we really need to move away from this notion of competency, but really to sort of think about cultural relevance, maybe sort of look at that a little differently. And so you want all social workers should be striving to ensure that their services are culturally relevant, culturally appropriate, but we can never become culturally competent. And this notion of becoming culturally competent really, I think, closes more doors than it opens.
Right. So
I think that for that manager and others who may be listening, I would encourage people to sort of really do an inventory of the community they're in, and then the workers who's serving the community, and then look at what gaps exist. And just as we encourage individual workers to really look at themselves to say, well, where am I? What are my biases? I think institutions can do the same sort of thing. How is this organization meeting the needs of the community that we're serving? And if we're not, what needs to be done differently?
Right.
And a number of organizations have been engaged in anti-oppressive practice, more diverse practice.
I have so many coming in right now that I'm going to try to pair two together right now. And I'm first going to read one from Manitoba, and she says, I am a Kenyan-born Canadian, and I have heard non-Black coworkers say things like white people are experiencing reverse racism due to diversity workplace policies. And how do I go about addressing this at work? And I'm going to pair that with another question that is, how do I open conversations with my coworkers about anti-Black racism when I can see that they don't realize they're a part of it?
Oh, those are both tough.
Right, yeah.
Both really tough. Well, let me start with just sort of that whole question about reverse racism. If we look at a definition of racism as being about prejudice plus power, then if you have no power, you don't have that capacity to be racist. So you may be prejudiced, but racism, has a particular rooted in white superiority. So I think the how do you open up conversations? It's really difficult. So depending on who you are and what your social location is, that's going to drive how you may enter into opening up a conversation. I mean, one of the things that I like to do is just to try to be as open as possible. So it's the witnessing. When you witness something, maybe trying to deal with it at the time, but also trying to look holistically at the situation.
Right.
I think that
I also have some here that are there's a.
I was just going to say, Sally, just interrupt you for a second. We could do a whole, and I have whole workshops on that. On that topic alone, you could do a whole workshop on that, because so much of it is nuanced as well. But I'll go back to the comment earlier about bravery. And you have to be really brave to be willing to open up these conversations and to be willing to go where the conversation will lead. And also having self-care is important. So being able to, I think one of the ways to not allow racism to be internalized. So if you're a racialized person, one of the ways, or if you're an ally, often allies also get confronted with a lot of these issues in negative ways. And so to not internalize that, it's really to have a good support system, having good self-care strategies, having ways that you can process these things. Teaching critical analysis is so important, so that you begin to sort of look outside. When I was leading the Racism, Violence, and Health Project, I got so much hate mail. Wow. And that in itself was traumatizing. So here I am trying to look at the impact of racism on health and well-being, and I was receiving all of this hate mail. And so what I decided to do, a way of processing it, was actually to create a hate mail file. And so the hate mail went into a particular file. And that really helped me create some distance between me and what was happening. When I'm working with people, or when I have worked with people who are experiencing a lot of racism, I try to get them to journal. Because sometimes if it's all in your head, then that can be distressing and can have an impact on your health. I know we're running out of time, so sorry. I'll go back to you, Sally.
No, we're. I think we probably have time for two or three more questions. I would say.
Okay.
I want to acknowledge to the audience that we're getting so many questions about exactly what you're already sort of talking about in terms of addressing, like using bravery to address those subtle microaggressions that over time pile up and are horrible in the workplace, especially. So I think that what I'll do is ask a few questions that are a little bit unrelated to that, and then let you maybe have some final thoughts on that microaggression piece. But right now, I just want to pivot to a question that's more of at a higher policy level. Someone's asking about the UN report, and it says the UN report notes that African Canadian women and girls are increasingly targeted by police services, and that they're one of the fastest growing prison populations. So when we're discussing the ways in which anti-Black racism persists for women, what strategies can be taken to better support specifically women's needs?
So I think part of that, in terms of the sort of communities and networks of people addressing women issues relating to women and girls, we need to ensure that they're bringing this race lens to that work as well, and that Black women and girls are included as a core part of that work. So that's one of the things that we can do. I think bringing attention and awareness to this is very, very important. Engaging girls and women in conversations and discussion about actions that they can take, and then educating. If we think about, we go back to the earlier conversation around the institutional racism and the institutional racism and the ways in which different institutions manifest. This would be one of those examples coming out of the justice system. And so if we think about the work, and a lot of work has been done over the years, but part of the problem, I think, is that we haven't gotten to some of the root causes. So when we get to those root causes, a lot of times people will say, well, I don't want to deal with individual racism anymore. I want to just tackle institutional racism. I say it's not an either or, it's a both and, because individuals work in institutions. And so individual biases actually do drive those biases that we see happening in institutions. So we need to be working, I think, on multiple levels. It goes back to the point I made earlier. These are systemic issues, and they require systemic responses. And so dealing with police services, dealing also within communities, dealing with organizations that are addressing gender issues, getting them to look more at intersectionality pieces. All of those things will help.
Right. I mean, thank you so much. I'm looking at these Q&As, and there's still a ton we haven't gotten to, but we are about 3 minutes out from the end. So I guess just knowing that, so from the white or sort of ally section of our audience, we're getting a lot of things like, when I try to open up a conversation about racism with others, I hear from my white colleagues, oh, I'm not racist, and the conversation gets shut down, and how frustrating this is. And then from others in the audience, they're asking for, I think, like practical advice in terms of opening those brave conversations to address microaggressions. And so with those sort of things in mind, I guess I'm just wondering if you had any final thoughts as we move towards the conclusion.
So let's start with the, oh, I'm not racist, when you hear that kind of comment. I would start, so instead of having that shut the conversation down, I would encourage people who hear that to use it as a way to further open the conversation. And so you could further open that conversation by saying something like, oh my goodness, isn't that amazing? So as a Canadian, to not be racist, tell me, how did you get here? What did you do to get to a place where you are no longer a person who is racist? How did you become an anti-racist? Or people used to use the term years ago, non-racist. If you're non-racist, that's a very passive kind of position to be in. And so one of the ways when someone says that, one of the things you can say is, so tell me more about that. Tell me how you got here. Right. So that's how I would sort of try to deal with that. And then with microaggressions, I mean, that's a tougher one. It really is. But in one of the courses that I taught at the Dalhousie School of Social Work, I had an assignment, an assignment where where students had to take action on microaggression that they experienced or witnessed. And myself and two colleagues who were both working with me as TAs on those courses at different times, we've actually written an article that's coming out very shortly, on, I think we call it creating brave spaces in social work. And it's really about dealing with microaggression. So that's going to be out very soon. It's being published in the White Privilege Journal. And as soon as it's out, I will make a link to that available, because I think it has some really practical kind of suggestions for dealing with microaggressions. And the other thing that I will do, I will look for that assignment, because that assignment is something I think I could send out right away and sort of modify it. I'll modify the assignment, but I think the specific things that we were asking students to do. So what we were asking them to do was to move beyond awareness and analysis to action. It's also important to keep in mind that sometimes non-action, a decision to not take action, is in itself an action. I talked a few minutes ago about there being no such thing as safety in terms of the context of addressing and dealing with anti-Black racism. But we also don't want people to put themselves at unnecessary risk either. And so sometimes you may be in a situation where non-action is the best thing to do at that particular time. So I will unearth that assignment, and I'm a little bit distant now from that work, but I know I still have that assignment. So I'll find that, and I'll send it out. I think we can do that, Sally.
Yeah, we can also include it as a resource in the next presentation along that left-hand side. And I also wanted to say, too, that we're going to be posting the link to the UN report on anti-Black racism that you mentioned on our website under the Continuing Education tab. So for those of you that want to go back and look at the slides or access this presentation again, the link to that will be right underneath there.
Okay.
And did you have any...
And when that article is published, I will make sure it's available. A link to it. It's an online journal, so I'll make sure a link to it is available.
Well,
there's a conference coming up at Princeton University in the spring, and I think I have a early notice of that, so we can make that available as well. It's the White Privilege Conference, and so they're looking at anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism through that lens of white privilege. It's going to be a great conference. That's coming up in May.
I'm just looking at the time. We're just over an hour now, so I do have to wrap up and just say another huge thank you to you, Senator Bernard. I learned so much today, and we are getting so many messages of thanks from the audience right now, even as we're wrapping up. People just saying a huge thank you, very informative and much-needed conversation. So I think that we are all just so thankful for your time today. Quick housekeeping before we close. The recording, again, will be uploaded on CSW's website tomorrow. For those who require it, that confirmation of attendance will be available now by clicking the yellow icon at the bottom. Do take a moment now, or as you're leaving the window, to vote on what the topic should be for the third part of the series. You can do so by clicking that green icon at the bottom of the window. We look forward to seeing you all again for the second part of the series coming up on November 2nd, when we will do our best to address the questions that haven't been addressed yet. And with that, another sincere thank you to Senator Bernard and to the audience for your questions and attention. And we will see you next time, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.